The last of this trio of unfortunate social psychology studies that we want to address is the most famous of them all. You've probably heard of the Stanford prison experiment. It was conducted by Philip Zimbardo, seen there on the left, and on the right you can see a snapshot from it, taken from his website. Now, this was conducted in 1971, and we'll get to the motivation behind it after we view what happened and what its consequences were. It was a slightly odd study with a lot of role play, in which volunteers were randomly assigned the role of either guards or prisoners. And the random selection this time is real, unlike the Milgram experiment, where everyone got the same role. And it was planned to run this fake prison for 14 days, but it was ended after 6 days, after Zimbardo's then girlfriend, later wife, intervened and raised concerns about the well-being of the volunteers. And that's the only woman that's going to appear in this story because, as usual in social psychology, everybody involved, the experimenter and all the subjects were male. Now I want to be very clear about the infamous Stanford prison experiment. It was not an experiment. It is often mistakenly treated as if it was. It was not conducted in a manner that could have ever informed science, and it did not lead to any conclusions that we can rely on, even though such conclusions have been out there and claimed and asserted in the literature again and again. So, in order to follow this rather peculiar case, we need to distinguish between three things. We need to understand what happened in 1971. Then we need to understand how the myths and stories of that particular event were promulgated and propagated by Philip Zimbardo himself, largely through the medium of his website and his authority. He later on went on to be the president of the American Psychological Association, a very prestigious position. And then we need to look briefly at the social consequences of all that happened there. And then we can look at the motivation. So first to the events themselves. As I said, the basement of the entire Stanford psychology department was turned into a mock prison with cells. There was an awful lot of cosplay. Prisoners were, quote unquote, arrested at their residences. They were issued what were called prison issue uniforms, but are actually surgical smocks, which are not worn in prisons. So they got that one wrong, don't worry about it. They were placed in cells. They had limited freedom to exercise and interact. And things went south. Things went bad. Conditions deteriorated. Some guards acted in an abusive manner. Some prisoners exhibited trauma. At least one of them had to be taken out of there prematurely. And very importantly, Philip Zimbardo was on the floor of the basement for the whole time, egging people on and influencing their behavior. The whole thing was abandoned after 6 days. So that's more or less what happened in 1971. Now we turn to the myths and stories that came out of that. The story of the Stanford prison experiment has been curated by Philip Zimbardo himself, largely through a website that still exists, and he still persists in this today, unfortunately, and it perpetuates all the known myths about the experiment. Those photographs you see there are taken from the website. Notice, for example, the guard on the bottom right with the reflective teardrop shades, a quote from the film Cool Hand Luke, in case you're interested. Certainly not standard issue in prisons, but part of the theatre that Zimbardo instilled into this whole thing. You can see the gowns that people are wearing there look nothing like prison clothes. It's really important that we hear about this from someone other than Philip Zimbardo himself, who has a great personal interest in perpetuating the myth of the Stanford prison experiment. So your required reading for this week includes a Reddit forum done. You may be familiar with the I am a form of Reddit threads, where someone who's interesting for some reason, so an elephant keeper or a president, Barack Obama did one, or an astronaut, will answer questions from users. Well, one of the original guards from the 1971 Stanford prison experiment did one of these recently and answered lots of people's questions. And it's very important to get that perspective as well. And what you'll see conflicts strongly with the popular versions of what went on. So what is the story that Philip Zimbardo was flogging here? Well, there's a facile, untrustworthy interpretation of the events here but it's often repeated. And this asserts that the guards, by putting on their uniforms, became brutal machines. And the prisoners, by putting on their uniforms, their surgical smocks, became humiliated subjects, lacking any agency or power. And so there's a form of depersonalization that happens to both, which removes them of their individual agency and is attributed then to the group to which they were assigned. You're a prisoner, you're a guard. And this interpretation can be taken to fanciful lengths, suggesting that social roles develop group norms which people necessarily comply with, and they surrender their individual agency when they adopt one of these social roles. Now, these assertions are not supported by any scientific evidence. They are still peddled by Philip Zimbardo. I want you to treat him as very untrustworthy. Let's begin with the observation that this was not an experiment. In an experiment, you have at least two control conditions. There's no experimental control here, and this is not a unique, naturally occurring phenomenon like an eclipse. There was no reliable data gathered. There's some unordered video footage and photographs of the event, but there was no systematic means of capturing data. There was no analysis of data, no statistical review of data. There was no peer-reviewed publications that came out of this, no science. There was no science, and there could be no science under these theatrical conditions. The simplistic story about the prisoners being abject, lacking agency, and the guards being brutal is complicated when we look and find out what happens. There was resistance by the prisoners. They were not totally humiliated and subordinate, and the majority of a lot of the guards did not act tyrannically. And then there's that peculiar role of Zimbardo in the middle of the action, telling people what to do. That alone would destroy any semblance of scientific credibility for this. You don't tell your experimental subjects what to do in that sense. And yet, within 2 years, we see a claim like this appearing in the scientific literature, citing or referring to the Stanford prison experiment. Guard aggression was omitted simply as a consequence of being in the uniform of a guard, excuse me, and asserting the power inherent in that role. I want you to see that claim as extremely problematic, and I want to see that it does damage to society when claims like this, which are not scientifically warranted, are peddled under the name of science. So, to see why this is really problematic, let's fast forward to the Second Iraq War in 2003-2004. The Americans had gone back into Iraq, this time to depose Saddam Hussein. They'd taken over Baghdad, deposed the regime, and there was a notorious prison on the outskirts called the Abu Ghraib prison. Saddam Hussein had used this as a detention center for torturing and even murdering his prisoners. The Americans took it over and tortured and murdered prisoners in there too. Photographs of this got out, and they caused something of a huge scandal. You can see some of them there. The one in the middle is particularly iconic. A person standing on a box hooked up to electric wires in a wet basement. So if they leave the box, they will get an electric shock, or so they believe. There was dogs involved. There was sexual abuse. It was an absolute shambles. When these photographs emerged, the question was, well, who's responsible for this? And Philip Zimbardo proved to be very useful then to the political powers that had organized the invasion, that were responsible for the military strategy, that organized Abu Ghraib prison. So a few of the guards from the prison were put on trial, but nobody who gave orders to them, nobody who directed or was actually responsible for setting up the situation was ever put on trial for this. And Philip Zimbardo was called as an expert witness because of his experience in the Stanford prison experiment. He made a very convenient expert witness because he was able to stop the damage, to insist, based on his nonsense on the Stanford prison experiment, that it was merely the role of the guards and prisoners that was responsible for the terrible events in Abu Ghraib. So he proved to be very useful, and this clearly illustrates the dangers of such abuse of scientific credibility. And As with the Milgram experiment, we noticed that there was a non-replication thereafter. It gets worse with the Stanford prison experiment, which, as I said, wasn't even an experiment, and you'll see accounts of something called the experiment replicating the 2006 one, and this lies entirely in the domain of reality TV, so science has completely left the building at this stage. So it has not been repeated and will not be repeated because it's not an experiment that you can repeat. It has been misused, misreported. In the last 5 years, there's been a wave of criticism of this, and it's thoroughly discredited now, but unfortunately, Philip Zimbardo still gets to sell his wares. Finally, we need to ask, what was this peculiar work responding to? Well, the early 1970s in America saw the conjunction of the civil rights movement with a newly assertive African-American populace being confronted by state violence. Frequently, the newspapers and the television screens were filled of violent clashes between cops in uniforms and protesters. At the same time, there were massive protests against the Vietnam War. It wasn't all race-based and civil rights, it was also a protest against the Vietnam War, and they frequently turned violent as well. So American homes are being filled in the newspapers and in the televisions, and the television played a huge role here, with all these images of figures of authority in uniform having violent clashes with protesters of various kinds. There's some of the images that were entirely typical from this time, and I think this makes it easier to understand why the Stanford prison experiment seems to be asking an important question. Unlike Harry Harlow and Stanley Milgram, this really didn't even pretend to be science. It simply claimed it was science. You can object, and one should object, to the experimental methods of Harry Harlow. One can object to the way subjects were treated in Stanley Milgram's case, but they were at least conducting something like a scientific inquiry. Philip Zimbardo wasn't. But once more, we have this existing as a response to very genuine fears and anxieties that were local in time and space. Expect the same thing to happen in the time of the virus. There will be no end of social psychology studies which 10 years later will look really peculiar and weird.